Welcome to our second episode of Smoking with Big Reds, and today we're going to cook the one thing I'm asked most about, ribs. All right, when we talk barbecue ribs, you're talking two main cuts, spare ribs and baby back ribs. Baby back ribs are also called loin back ribs. They're cut up closer to the spine of the pig, right up beside the loin, so it's a much leaner cut of meat, and all the meat is really on top of the ribs. Today we're going to do spare ribs. Spare ribs come just below the baby back ribs, and they're a lot fattier cut of ribs, and we're going to do a St. Louis cut on these ribs today. What you want to do when you look for these ribs is you want to check out, make sure they're not too thin. A lot of times you'll get some ribs that are very thin right here. They're going to be hard to cook. You want a lot of meat on these things. So get a nice thick rack of ribs. This one rack was about 6 pounds. That's a good size to shoot for. This right here is the whole spare. So what I mean by that is if you look over here, we have all your bones, and then we have what we call the rib tips right here. We're going to take our knife and we're going to cut this off, and we're going to have a nice square slab of ribs, and that's what we call our St. Louis cut of ribs. So to start doing that, I'm just going to flip it over. I'm going to take my knife, and you want to follow your finger along the lines of these bones, and you want to find the longest bone in this whole entire rack. We'll start right here, kind of make us a little mark, and then you just want to square up. Make a straight line parallel to the bottom row of these ribs. Once we get our mark going, then we can start cutting in. And we're actually not going to waste this piece that we're cutting off. Now I'll show you what we're going to do with that too. A lot of people use different things. You can actually cook these and make what we call rib tips, or some people grind it up, make sausage out of it, and various things like that. We're going to do rib tips today with it. This bone's a little thick on this side. There we go. So now that we got that piece off, you'll notice here we got some fat sticking out. You want to trim that off. You just want to square everything up, make it look nice and neat. We'll flip it back over. You'll notice on this end, kind of tapers off. There's some very small bones, a little bit of cartilage in here. Those are going to burn up and cook off, and they're not going to cook even with the rest of this rack, so we're just going to trim that off. Take our knife, make a nice square cut there. You got this nice rack of ribs. From here, you'll see some fat pockets on top. All this fat's not going to cook out, especially with the method I'm going to show you today, because the method I'm going to show you today is a little different than most of the methods you're going to read on the internet. But you just want to take your fingers, kind of grab up this fat, and we'll just kind of cut it out. You're going to find some racks of ribs are going to have a lot of this in there. Some doesn't really have that much. You don't have to worry about getting it all out, but there'll be a big bunch in there in a lot of these racks, and you just want to grab as much of it out as you can. The next real important thing on these racks is the silver skin. It's a membrane right here on the back. We want to make sure we get all of that off so you get some nice smoke penetration to the meat, and also it can make it a little tough on the bottom if you take it off when you're eating it. So we'll take a small knife, and you just want to kind of work your way under between the bone and this membrane and get a little piece of it started. And this can be very difficult to get off, but with practice you'll come up with a method. So just get a little bit of it where it'll peel up, and the easiest thing I found to use is a little paper towel. Get the little paper towel, use it to grip, get a hold of this membrane. If you're lucky, you get it all to come off in one pull. Sometimes we're not so lucky. We'll see if we can get it going today. Doesn't look like it. So you see that membrane coming off there? About half of it came off. We still have some up top, so we're just going to try to get under there and grab the rest of it off as well. Now that this membrane's off, you can see completely different look on the back side of these ribs where the meat's actually exposed now. It doesn't have that thick protective layer. And so that's going to allow us to get our rub seasoning in there, and it's going to allow the smoke to penetrate the back. And you also want to feel around, make sure there's no just odd fatty pieces. This piece right here we're going to kind of cut off, set to the side. There's also, sometimes you'll have a large flap right here. You want to cut that off because it's going to not allow the ribs to cook evenly on the back, and it's just extra meat to get in the way. We're going to take that off. A few more little fatty pieces here on the back. And here we have our trimmed rack of St. Louis cut spare ribs. Now that we have our ribs, before we rub it, we're going to get these rib tips together because there's no point in wasting all this extra meat. So what we're going to do with the rib tips, there's going to be a line of cartilage in here, and there's a big bone right here. We want to cut all this cartilage out. Some people will cook it with it in there. I personally like to cut everything out. That way I don't have to worry about biting into anything. So you just want to find the end of that cartilage, and we're just going to cut down in there and remove this layer of meat here. This is all bone and cartilage here, so we'll discard this along with our scraps. We'll have our St. Louis cut right here. We'll have some rib tips right here. We're going to rub everything the same way, cook everything the same way, and it's almost like you're going to have boneless ribs with this piece. Very flavorful meat. Alright, so now that we have our spare ribs trimmed, we got St. Louis cut, we got our rib tips, we're going to use a rub. The rub we're using today has some salt, sugar, black pepper, a little paprika, and some cayenne pepper. So it's going to give us a nice color, it's going to give us a little bit of kick. I like some sweet and some heat with the ribs. So I have a little dredge here, I put my rub in, and we're just going to get a nice coat on here. You know, these ribs are pretty thick. So we want a decent coat of rub on here so that we get a lot of flavor in there. And you got to think too, ribs, the way we're going to cook the ribs today, they cook kind of fast. So you're not going to have a whole lot of smoke exposure. So we want to get as much flavor in there as we can in any way that we can. When you rub, we'll get all the rub on the front and the back side. Also pick it up and get the edges here where the bones come out. We'll get the very end here. Flip it over, get this side nice and coated. Once you get it coated, you just kind of want to rub it in, make sure the rub's on there really well. A lot of people use a binder. You'll see yellow mustard, you'll see olive oil, peanut oil, things like that people put on the ribs before the rub to help the rub stick to the ribs. Me personally, I just throw the rub right on the ribs. I don't really feel it's necessary to do that. Nothing wrong with doing it, just personal preference. So now that we have the rub coated on all this, we're ready to go on the smoker. Smoker's cooking at 300 degrees, and we're going to put it on for 2 hours, just straight on the smoke. When we get done, we'll do some foil action, little other things, and we'll show you that in a few minutes. All right, we're going to let these cook for about 2 hours, and while we're waiting on them to cook, let's take a break and I'll sit through and talk to you about the method that I use to cook these ribs. So if you go out right now and search the internet for how to cook the ribs, you're going to find the 3-2-1 method. It's a very common, very popular method of smoking ribs, and it works great. You're going to cook at a low temperature, 3 hours on the smoke, 2 hours wrapped in foil, another hour back on the smoker. The method I came up with seems to work very well, and it cuts your cook time in half. We take the ribs, we rub them, put them on the smoker at 300 degrees, meat side up, for 2 hours. At the 2 hour mark, we're going to take them out. We're going to lay them in a packet of foil. We're going to add a little moisture, some liquid to add a little flavor and help with the tenderization of the ribs. We'll wrap them back in foil, and then we're going to put them on the smoker meat side down for 45 minutes. At the 45-minute mark, you're going to check for tenderness. More than likely, the tenderness is going to be spot on. We're going to take them off, unwrap, and place them back on the smoker meat side up. If you're wanting wet ribs, at this point, you're going to baste with sauce. If you're wanting dry ribs, at this point, we're going to add a little more rub. And cook for another 10 to 20 minutes just to let the sauce set or the dry rub set on the ribs. Take them off, and it's good eats all the way. All right, now that our ribs have been on the smoker at 300 degrees for 2 hours, it's time to wrap them in foil. This is going to give it a lot of flavor and make the ribs much more tender. You see our ribs here, they're very hot. The bark is formed nicely. And at this point, I'm going to take these and we want to turn them meat side down in the foil. I'm going to take the foil and just kind of try to make a little bit of a boat so that our liquid doesn't run out. For the liquid part, I'm going to use, a lot of times I'll use apple juice. You could use, I've heard of people using sweet tea. This is actually a pineapple flavored apple juice, something new I'm going to try today. Thought it may give it a nice another little layer of flavor. You don't need a whole lot in here. I'm just going to pour just a little bit. And that is just going to help retain some moisture in there. It's going to help add another layer of flavor, create a little steam, make it really nice and tender. You want to seal it up really nice and tight. Be careful too, because by now the bones are going to start poking out a little bit, and it's very easy to pierce this foil. So you don't want to lose all those juices by piercing the foil now. So make sure it's real nice and tight. Use heavy duty foil, double layered if you need to. Once we get it wrapped with our liquid in, we're going to put it back on the smoker, still 300 degrees, for 45 minutes. All right, now that our ribs have cooked for 45 minutes, in the foil, we're going to take them off and we're going to start basting. So we'll open them up. You're going to see that the bones are starting to expose a little bit now. The ribs are going to be very tender, so be careful. Got a nice color on them. You can see how tender they are. They're already starting to break apart here in the middle. I'm going to show you 2 racks of ribs right now because we're going to do one wet and one dry. Oh yeah, nice color on the ribs. You can see right here, the bones are already starting, the meat's pulling back away from the bones. Once we lay them out, you want to put some flavor on the underside and the top side. So this is going to be our wet rack, this will be our dry rack. We're just going to take, for the dry, we'll take a little bit of our rub. We're just going to add a little more to it. There's a lot of moisture on these from being in that foil with the extra liquid that we put in, and so the moisture on the outside is going to help this extra rub stick. Just get another little layer of bark and flavor for the dry ribs. Now for the wet ribs, I'm going to take a sauce here. This is a sweet Kansas City based style sauce, tomato based sauce. We'll just take it in our basting brush. I'm going to baste the underside. Once we get the underside basted, we'll flip it over, we'll get the top side. And then we're going to put these back on the smoker for 10 to 20 minutes just to let it set. If in any reason when you do this method, when you baste these or put your dry rub on and you go to put them back on, you don't feel like they're quite tender enough yet, you can let them cook a little longer than the 10 to 20 minutes just to get the tenderness where you're looking for. But these are looking great. I'm sure the smoke ring is going to look great on these when we cut them in a few minutes. I'm sure they're going to taste great too. You've got to try these out. It's very simple, very easy to do, and you will be amazed if you've not had real barbecue ribs how well this is going to taste. So I'm going to put these back on the smoker, 10, 15 minutes, 20 minutes maybe. We'll take them off, we'll slice them, and we're going to try them out and see what they taste like. All right, we've had our ribs on the smoker for about 15 minutes, letting the glaze and the rub set. If you look here, we got a nice mahogany color on our ribs. That's what you're looking for when you do wet ribs. On our dry ribs, you can see that you can still see some of the bark or the extra rub that we added, and it's set up nicely on here. So now what we're going to do now is we're going to slice them, we're going to taste them, and see how we did today. The best way I found to slice these, because a lot of times the spare ribs, you're going to have, some racks going to have straight bones, some racks going to have crooked bones. So you get a nice pretty slice. I like to flip them over because I can actually see where the bones are. And the best ribs are going to come from right in the middle of the rack. So we're going to take these, and I'm just going to slice right down the middle between two bones. If you look here, you can see a nice smoke ring on the meat. So that's our dry ribs. Slide these over to the side and let's see how our wet ribs turned out. So here's our wet ribs. You can still see a nice pink smoke ring all the way around here. We'll give them a bite, see what the texture's like. Very good, very flavorful, very tender. You can see it held the crescent bite in my mouth, slight tug, come off, clean off the bone. Exactly what you're looking for with ribs. If you've never cooked your own ribs, if you're used to the chain store ribs, you've got to go to the store, buy you some ribs, fire up your grill, fire up your smoker. Try this method, you won't be disappointed.